The sun was setting over the canals of Xochimilco, painting the sky with hues of gold and crimson. Alejandro shifted uneasily in his seat as the small boat drifted through the waters, guided by an old man with weathered hands. The oars sliced through the water with a rhythmic splash, each stroke pulling them deeper into the maze of canals that crisscrossed the floating gardens of Mexico City's ancient district. Next to Alejandro, his sister Sofia gazed at the darkening horizon, her face a mask of quiet apprehension. They'd grown up hearing the stories, the same tales their grandmother had told them every night when they were children. The island of Las Monicas, the island of dolls, had always seemed like a distant nightmare. A haunted place where the dead whispered through the trees and the broken bodies of dolls stared out with lifeless eyes. It had been more of a legend than a reality to them, a campfire tale to keep children from wandering too far into the canals. But now they were headed there. Alejandro had come up with the idea as a joke at first. It had been years since their grandmother had passed, and on the anniversary of her death, he'd suggested they visit the island, more as a way to honor her memory than anything else. Sofia had agreed, but now, as they drew closer to the infamous island, the air felt thick with unease. The boat creaked, and the light breeze seemed to carry a faint whisper through the trees. "Are you sure about this?" Sofia finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't need to say what they both were thinking. The island was cursed. Alejandro forced a smile, trying to hide the knot of anxiety forming in his stomach. "It's just an island," he said, but even he didn't believe it. The boatman glanced back at them, his old eyes gleaming in the fading light. "They say the spirits are restless tonight," he murmured in a voice hoarse from years of use. "Especially on nights like this, when the moon is full." Alejandro frowned. "You don't believe in the stories, do you?" The old man's gaze lingered on Alejandro for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he simply shrugged. "I've seen things." Silence fell between them as the island came into view. Even from a distance, the sight was unsettling. The trees loomed over the water, their branches heavy with the weight of hundreds, no thousands, of dolls. Some were old and weathered, their faces cracked and peeling. Others were newer, but even they seemed out of place, hanging like forgotten sentinels, their dead eyes staring vacantly into the void. The boatman pulled the oars in as they neared the shore. "This is where I leave you," he said, his voice low. "I'll come back for you in 2 hours if you last that long." Alejandro nodded, though he couldn't shake the chill running down his spine. Sofia remained silent as they stepped out of the boat and onto the island's shore. The boatman turned without a word and began rowing back into the mists, his figure quickly swallowed by the dense fog that had begun to settle over the water. They stood there for a moment, listening to the eerie quiet that had fallen over the island. The only sound was the soft creaking of the dolls swaying in the trees. "This was a mistake," Sofia whispered. Alejandro was about to agree when something caught his eye. Near the base of a tree, barely visible in the dim light, was a small wooden shrine. At its center, a tattered doll with hollow eyes sat propped up against a makeshift altar. Candles, long burned out, surrounded it, and strange symbols were etched into the bark of the tree. The air around it seemed colder, denser, and with each step they took closer, Alejandro's unease grew. "They say the caretaker of this island was a man named Don Julian," Sofia said, her voice trembling. "He found a little girl who drowned in the canal, and after that, he began collecting dolls to appease her spirit. He believed the dolls were alive, that they spoke to him." Alejandro knelt by the shrine, studying the doll. Its glassy eyes seemed to follow him, though he knew it was impossible. Still, there was something deeply unsettling about it. He reached out, hesitating for a moment before touching the doll's cracked face. The moment his fingers brushed its surface, a cold gust of wind whipped through the trees, rattling the dolls like bones. Sofia gasped, stepping back, and Alejandro's heart skipped a beat. He stood quickly, his pulse racing. "Let's just look around and get out of here," Sophia urged, glancing nervously at the swaying trees. They wandered deeper into the island, but everywhere they went, the dolls were there, hanging from trees, nailed to posts, or half buried in the ground. Some were missing limbs, others had been burned or decayed by time and the elements. Yet each one seemed to watch them with an eerie, silent intensity. As they moved through the narrow paths, the light faded quickly, and the island grew darker. Shadows stretched long and thin, and the wind carried with it a sound, a faint, high-pitched giggle. Alejandro stopped in his tracks, straining to hear it again. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Sophia nodded, her eyes wide with fear. It sounded like a child. They stood frozen for a moment, listening. The giggle came again, this time closer. Alejandro's blood ran cold as the sound grew louder, followed by a soft shuffling noise, like feet moving through the brush. "Who's there?" Alejandro called out, though his voice shook. There was no response, only the rustling of leaves and the creaking of dolls swaying in the wind. Suddenly, Sophia grabbed his arm. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice urgent. "Now." Before Alejandro could respond, a movement caught his eye. In the dim light just beyond the trees, a figure stood among the dolls. It was small, barely the size of a child, but its face was obscured by the shadows. For a moment, Alejandro thought it was another doll, until it moved. The figure tilted its head, as if studying them, then took a step forward. Alejandro's breath caught in his throat. The figure's face came into view, and he realized with a sickening lurch that it wasn't a child at all. It was a doll. A life-size doll, with cracked porcelain skin and hollow eyes, but it moved with a slow, deliberate grace. "Sophia Ra!" Alejandro shouted, pulling his sister with him as they turned and sprinted down the path. Behind them, the sound of footsteps echoed through the trees, faster now, gaining on them. The giggles grew louder, more distorted, until they filled the air like a twisted symphony. Dolls swayed violently in the wind, their eyes gleaming in the darkness as if they were watching, waiting. They stumbled through the underbrush, the boat nowhere in sight. The fog had thickened, swallowing the shore and leaving them disoriented, trapped on this cursed island. "Over there." Sophia pointed toward a small hut at the edge of the clearing. Without thinking, they bolted for it, slamming the door shut behind them as they collapsed inside, gasping for breath. The interior of the hut was dark, lit only by a single flickering candle. Dolls lined the walls, their eyes staring down at them, their faces twisted into grotesque smiles. In the corner of the room, an old decaying figure sat slumped over a chair, a man, his skeletal hands clutching a doll to his chest. Alejandro's heart pounded as he realized who it was. "Don Julian," he whispered. The caretaker of the island, long dead, but still clutching the doll that had driven him mad. Sophia backed away, her eyes wide with terror. "Alejandro, we have to get out of here." But before they could move, the door creaked open behind them. They turned slowly, their breath catching in their throats. Standing in the doorway was the doll, the life-sized figure that had followed them. Its hollow eyes gleamed in the candlelight, and for a moment it simply stood there, staring at them with an eerie stillness. Then it smiled. The door slammed shut, and the dolls lining the walls began to move. Their heads twisted on their fragile necks, their limbs creaked as they shifted, and one by one they turned to face Alejandro and Sophia. The whispering began, soft, unintelligible, but growing louder, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. The dolls' eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and their mouths twisted into sinister grins. Alejandro felt his blood turn to ice. The legends were true. The dolls were alive. They had always been alive. As the dolls closed in, their porcelain faces gleaming in the dim light, Alejandro and Sofia realized with a sickening certainty that they would never leave the island. The dolls had been waiting for them, waiting for new souls to join their twisted collection. And now, they would never be able to escape.